What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 296. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. And joining me on the other line, fresh off of work but not basketball, it's Scott-Vargas.
I actually would prefer you to introduce me as Gold Pro Scott-Vargas.
Oh, hello, Gold Pro Scott-Vargas. Congratulations. A worthy accomplishment, especially for somebody like you who does so much stuff as far as Magic content and, of course, a full-time job on top of all of that.
I thought you were going to, give a caveat about someone who's, a little out of practice, someone who just just passed his prime.
No. I'm being much nicer to you. I honestly think it is a pretty darn good accomplishment to pick up gold. Obviously, you would have preferred to have platinum, but given your schedule and stuff, I think gold is a pretty good thing. So congratulations on that. That's great, and hopefully next year is even better. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what we're going to be talking about today, I want to remind you that Channel Fireball sponsors this podcast each and every week. They bring you the show, and you can check out gpsandiego.com if you're going to go to the GP or if you're going to do a little last-minute planning. It is this weekend. It's coming right up. So if you haven't signed up, check out the website. You can get all the information you need about where the hotel is for the site, where the site is, how much it's going to cost you to get there, and all that kind of stuff at gpsandiego.com. Of course, you can check out channelfireball.com for all the usual awesomeness. You can get a whole bunch of great free content. You can get articles, videos, podcasts, all for free by some of the best players in the world, as well as a full selection of Magic Origins. You can get sealed product. You can get singles. Whatever it is you need that's Magic related, you will find it at channelfireball.com. If you want to support the show more directly, you can do so at patreon.com/limitedresources. There's a lot of cool little bonuses and perks you can get for signing up, and one of them is that you have the ability to submit a Patreon question of the week. I've picked one out for this week, and it is from our friend Cardboard Crack. If you haven't heard of Cardboard Crack, you guys know me. I don't recommend stuff that I don't read or like on my own, and Cardboard Crack is one of my favorite things about Magic. They do a great stick figure comic is what they're called, the real kind of stripped down basic comics, but really funny, just touching on a lot of the things that Magic players think about, and I highly recommend checking it out. But Cardboard Crack also supports the show. Thank you for that, and has a question here. When preparing for the Pro Tour with other players, this is obviously aimed at you, Luis, how do you prevent inbred draft strategies? For example, let's say everyone you're testing with decides that like 5 colors the best, like in cons or something, and soon people are fighting over color fixing and dual lands, and at least in your house metagame, it becomes hard to make that strategy work because there are too many people fighting for it. But the real fact is that at the PT, it might still be the best strategy to go with because not everyone is aware of it. But now you haven't even had a good chance to practice with it because of your in-house metagame. How do you avoid this type of situation?
Well, it's actually difficult, and it's one of the reasons that I, at least personally, have been leaning more towards practicing on Magic Online. That was, because of a different reason, because I actually wasn't able to make it to testing early. My circumstances dictated that is how I would test Limited, and that's my sole testing for the Pro Tour this time was online. I actually didn't do a single physical draft before the Pro Tour.
You're lucky you have me to give you great advice every week.
Yeah, right. Actually, this question's a really good one because it is something that happens, and even if you're not on like a Pro Tour testing team, even if you're drafting at your local shop, you're going to run into this, right? Like, let's say, you're in a draft pod with someone who drafts every single week. You know what their predilections are, and you know that like, well, this person's to my right. They love drafting blue-black. I guess I'm not going to draft blue-black. People have thought that, I've had that happen to me many times before I even knew what the Pro Tour was, that I would, do the Wednesday night draft at my local shop. And we had the same group of people drafting every night, or at least part of the same group of people. And you get to know what people like. And, that actually makes it harder to prepare for Limited at large, because many of the drafts you're going to be in during your life, it's going to be with people who you don't know what their tendencies are. So one way to kind of get out of this inbred stuff is to test online. Playing online helps. Varying your test groups helps. Having a bigger pool of drafters. For example, if you have a 15 or 16 person team, it's a lot easier to prevent inbred drafting than like a 10 person team. But
that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you have to use the information you have when it comes down to the actual like drafts that matter. And when you're drafting, like let's say you sit in the same pod as a teammate in the actual Pro Tour itself, then you should use their draft, tendencies to inform your picks because that's just good, valuable information. But if that's the only way you practice, then yeah, you're not going to know as much. I've heard tale of and seen it with my own eyes of plenty of different people or teams drafting where, oh, you're sitting to this person's left. I guess you can't draft 5-color because they slam lands every pick. And yeah, that gives you less experience and you have to make sure to avoid that. So that's definitely not a good thing. And you just have to, the problem is it's hard to avoid this without consciously trying to. And even if you do, it's still difficult because sometimes some people like we talked about before, you end up forcing blue-black even though you're not trying to because you just evaluate those cards as being better. So the people you're talking about sometimes don't even know that they're forcing these things. So yeah, just opening up to a bigger pool of competitors is really the best way to avoid this.
This brings up another question that I have, and I've often wondered about while at the PT doing coverage and stuff, is there's assumptions that get made within your group, your team, right, about which colors are best or which cards are good or which strategies are good. And they kind of become lore, right? Like you talk about them, you have some arguments about them, there's some good discussions about them, and then you kind of come to a resting place where most of the people on the team will be like, yeah, we think that blue-red is the best, and we think that green-white is unplayable, that kind of thing. How much do you assume that the players you're playing against know that? I feel like there's a trap there, right? Where you might have figured that out and you might even be correct, but assuming that your opponents know that is maybe a step too far.
It depends on what kind of value you're trying to get. For example, I remember during Pro Tour Born of the Gods in Valencia where it was one of the cards that we evaluated differently as a team than we felt most people would was 3 in a blue, tap 2 creatures, they don't untap, scry 1. Sudden something or other. I don't remember the name of the actual card at this point.
I don't either now, yeah.
But anyway, that's what the card was. Instant, it tapped 2 things, they didn't untap for a turn, and you scryed 1. On its face, it didn't look great, but we found during our testing that this card is really, really good. So what that means is 2 things. One is that you can expect to get this card later than normal, which is good.
Sudden storm.
Yeah, sudden storm.
Oh, thank God.
That's just upside, right? Because you're getting a card that we think is a solid 3rd to 4th pick. We're going to routinely get it 7th pick.
Mm-hmm.
The downside is when you see 7th pick, it doesn't mean blue is open, and you have to make sure you understand that. Because
right.
In one of our house drafts, if we saw it 7th pick when everyone was pretty high on the card, you could think, well, the person on my right who passed this to me probably isn't blue because why would they pass this 4th pickable card so late? In the Pro Tour, you can't assume that. And you have to make sure not to fall into the trap of thinking because people evaluate other cards differently, they will send signals which aren't ones you're used to receiving. So there's pluses and minuses to being ahead of the curve when it comes to draft. More pluses overall. Understanding the format better is generally going to be better. Mm-hmm. But you do have to understand what information other people are working off of because it is the sort of thing. It is, if you go to rock, paper, scissors, you want to be a step above. If you're 2 steps ahead, all of a sudden then you're a step below.
Yeah, this brings up a thing that I talk about on the show every once in a while, but is really something that came over from poker as well, which is, it's important to know, let's say you get a new tool or a fundamental strategy that you're going to employ, in your game, whether it's Magic, poker, whatever. One thing that can go horribly wrong is misapplying that tool, right? Like you can often put yourself in a worse situation than you would have been if you just played it straightforward by taking this information or this tool or whatever it happens to be and then using it incorrectly. You can actually, lose percentage points by doing that. So that is interesting. I totally agree with what you said about, look, more knowledge is better, right? That is a thing. But it is funny how you do have to have a fundamental understanding of how to apply these concepts. And if you do it wrong, you might actually be costing yourself, which is kind of crazy. You think, well, that person's employing a strategy. At least they're doing that rather than nothing. But sometimes it is actually better to do nothing if you don't fully understand how to deploy a strategy like that.
Definitely.
Let's crack a pack. What do you say?
Sounds good.
This is from Jacob Clodfetter. Thank you, Jacob. He gave me this, I believe, in Dallas, Fort Worth. where it managed to not snow this time. First up, Cobblebrute. I remember him being a bit better back in the Return to Ravnica days. Cobblebrute has not impressed me.
Well, Cobblebrute hasn't impressed me, but I don't actually mind Cobblebrute all that much. I have played Cobblebrute before. I've never first picked it, though.
Yeah. I have also played it. I just keep finding it's just like, you're just going to trade for something terrible.
It is kind of unfortunate that Fiery Impulse just deals with it so efficiently, though it does dodge Reap Soul.
It does indeed. Enshrouding Mist. Now, there's a magic card. How high on the list is this one for you now?
Enshrouding Mist is very high, and part of the reason that I like Enshrouding Mist so much is that you're just going to trade for a card, but you paid 1 mana, and they usually paid 2 to 4 mana, sometimes even 5.
Yeah, you basically always get a card out of it too. It's so hard to get blown out by with this card, and I think this is the best combat trick in the set. I think it's fantastic.
One of the reasons to draft white, I think, is that you can get Enshrouding Mist and still pretty late. I think people are still pretty undervaluing this card.
Weight of the Underworld.
Yeah, this is the kind of necessary evil. You're certainly going to play Weight of the Underworld because it is a removal spell, but it's just not a particularly effective one.
Yeah, that's what I find too. Send to Sleep is next.
I still don't like this card. I still haven't really
either.
seen a deck. Well, the only deck I've seen where this card was actually good was in Beness's Mono Blue Mill deck, but I'm going to go ahead and say that that's not an archetype you should be, on the hunt for.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one in a bit. That was so weird. Might of the Masses is next. Found it to be a serviceable combat trick as well, though. If I get my choice, I'm not taking it over Enshrouding Mist, that's for sure.
No, Enshrouding Mist is the better combat trick in a better color.
All right, now here's one. This is Shambling Ghoul. 1 and a black, 2/3, enters the battlefield tapped. First off, where are you at on Shambling Ghoul? You like it?
I like Shambling Ghoul. I don't think I've ever cut Shambling Ghoul from like a base black deck.
Yeah, I haven't either. And I tend to take it relatively high because I think it's one of the best 2-drops in black, if not. Here's a question for you. I was doing a coverage draft after the PT was over, and I was black-white. And I opened a pack that had a Shambling Ghoul and a Cleric of the Forward Order in it. I had already taken 1 Cleric of the Forward Order, so this would be my second, and I didn't have any Shambling Ghouls at this point. Assuming that I'm going to be equal parts black and white so that you don't have to put any weird mana considerations into it, which card do you like better?
So I've run into this exact pick before, and even with 0 previous Cleric of the Forward Orders, I would take the Cleric. I think the fact that...
You like the untap part?
The fact that the Cleric is untapped, and it gains you 2 life, means that in the late game, this is just going to have a much higher chance of having a big impact. And the 2 life is really relevant, especially since, like you said, sometimes it can be 4 to 6 life if you have other Clerics, and even if you don't, I generally am just going to go with the Cleric unless I have a compelling reason not to.
Yeah, I asked Eric Froelich happened to be hanging out there too, and I asked him, and he agrees with you, and that's also what I took. Separatist Void Mage. Hello, friend.
This is the best card so far. I like Separatist Void Mage a lot. I've come around on this card.
Yeah, I like it a lot too. I think it's super, super solid in the set. I think it does what you need to do to get caught back up on turn 4 if you've gotten off to a little bit of a slower start. And it's one of the few cards that actually creates a board presence while also setting your opponent back who's looking to leverage things like Renown or maybe putting a Grasp of the Hieromancer on their creature, something like that, where you can sort of recover and restabilize the board. And the 2/2 body actually trades for relevant threats in this format too. Vine Snare is next. That's the selective fog. I still haven't found a spot for that to be good. Heavy Infantry, a card I've been playing more than I'd probably like to. It's okay. It's the 4 and a white 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you tap a creature an opponent controls. This is a card you look to cut, right? Like you don't want to submit a deck that has these in it, but I have found that if I've had to, I can do worse than a Heavy Infantry.
I've definitely played the card, but I've cut it more often than I've played it, and I'm happy continuing that with that ratio.
Yeah. Now this next one has impressed me. It's Pricklebore. That's the 3/3 for 5, and when it as long as it's your turn, it gets +2/+0 and has first strike.
Yeah, I like Pricklebore. I've generally wanted to have 1 to 2 in my red decks.
Yeah, that's kind of where I've been at too. It just hits the stage of if you get off to a decent start, let's say you're playing red-white, you get off to a decent start, you get your opponent down to 10 or 12, and then you play a Pricklebore, and they're just like, crap. Like, they interacting with Pricklebore in combat, when you have all these extra combat tricks available to you in green-red or red-white, is like very problematic. And even just having enough stuff to put in front of it to just, let's say that you could see that like your opponent's hellbent and you just can block can be really hard too. I mean, 5 first strike is a heck of a lot to get through. And then you have to have enough left over to get through 3 toughness, as well. So I think the card's pretty good. All right. Prism Ring.
Yeah, I was like, Prison Ring. What
Prison
is
Ring. I think if it was called Prison Ring, I'd be more likely to take it. But Prism Ring, on the other hand, I'm kind of out on.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
It's dead to me. All right, we've got a gold card here. Citadel Castellan, a card that you and I talked about on the podcast all the way back before the set came out. And, I mean, it's lived up for me. Like, the thing's just scary. It's a 2/3 for 3 with Vigilance and Renown 2. And if it ever connects, your opponent is very, very unhappy and needs to find an answer very quickly. It's one of those cards that kind of changes the way a board plays out. Your opponent can't really attack you often, and even if they could, they really have to think twice about doing it because, again, if this Castellan hits, they just are going to have such a hard time attacking into a 4/5 that early in the game, and it takes big chunks out of their life total too. Doesn't give them a lot of time to get the shield set up.
The question is, would you take a multicolor card over Separatist Void Mage, pick one, pack one, even though I do believe the Castellan is better?
Yeah, I do believe that is the case as well. And no, I wouldn't. No, I don't think any of the gold cards, they've done a really weird job with those of like balancing them out so that I don't feel compelled to do that. But then they're so good in the decks that they go in. Like, I think all of them are really good in the decks that they go in, right? It's weird. You'd think that them being that strong would make me want to just be like, oh, screw it, I'll take the Castellan and hope to get there. But the fact is, I do not like splashing in this format. I effectively never do it. And I really just hate the idea of committing to 2 colors. Now, if you take the Separatist Void Mage out of the equation and replace it with something that I'm not interested in playing at all and leave me with Citadel Castellan or Enshrouding Mist, I mean, that's a conversation I could have, and I probably would just take the Castellan and just say, you know what, if this doesn't work, that's fine. But Enshrouding Mist, while I do think it's a premium combat trick, you know, that isn't as good as a premium creature, and Castellan is one of those.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I think I would take the Separatist Void Mage here. It's pretty close. I do think I would take Hero of Eros, the red-white gold card. I would take that one. I think that's...
Oh, yeah?
I think that the red and white are a good enough color combination to be in. And the payoff is much higher. I believe Hero is just, absurd because it just combines so well with so many other cards and it's just great by itself. It's a 4-power creature for 3 mana.
Yeah.
I would take Hero in this spot, but I would not take Citadel Castellan. Part of it is that I don't think green-white is as good of a combination.
Sure. Last uncommon is Fiery Conclusion, a card that it took me a long time to actually play. I just never seemed to have one or have one available to me. But I've played it twice now in the last, few drafts that I've played. And I've been reasonably happy with it. Look, I mean, this card isn't great. It really isn't. It only hits creatures. Of course, this is the 1 in a red instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you got to sack a creature. It does 5 damage to a creature. But man, the relative lack of removal in the format means that I actually like having this as a kind of pressure release valve against my opponent's, whatever 5 toughness, 4 toughness creature that I just don't really have ways to deal with often. Especially because, well, for me, both times I played Fiery Conclusion was in red-white, where it wasn't too difficult for me to find a token or a creature that had been locked down by a claustrophobia or something like that, or just a Cleric of the Forward Order that had kind of overstayed its welcome. I did find that easy. I could see in a deck that wasn't set up that way, and having to sacrifice a full card every time or most of the time being pretty annoying. But for me, it's like doing 5 damage to a creature is actually worth that, especially given that it's at instant speed and you can, set up scenarios where your creature may have died anyway, or it's chump blocking, or it's being targeted with removal or whatever.
Yeah, I've been happy enough with Fiery Conclusion. I think removal, especially good removal, is sparse enough that it's worth playing this. And yeah, the presence of suppression bonds and claustrophobia make it a lot more likely that you'll have something that you want to throw away. Plus, as you said, there are a couple ways to kind of get free creatures to toss.
Yeah. All right, our rare. Gaia's Revenge. So that's a 7 mana, 8/5 with haste, can't be countered, can't be the target of spells. or excuse me, of non-green spells or abilities from non-green sources.
Gaia's Revenge is definitely a card.
It is a beating. Do I want to take a green 7-drop pack one, pick one? I don't think the answer is yes.
I mean, I'm in for green 7-drops, but I think...
God, this is a tough pack. I actually don't know what I would take out of this pack offhand. I don't have a clear answer for myself here. I'm looking at Enshrouding Mist, Citadel Castellan, Fiery Conclusion, the Revenge, and the Void Mage here.
I would not take the Fiery Conclusion or Enshrouding Mist here.
Okay.
I would rather take Separatist, Void Mage, Citadel Castellan, or Gaia's Revenge. Of those cards, I actually think I'm leaning towards Separatist, Void Mage. And this might be something we want to go into later, but I do like blue a lot more than I did prior to the Pro Tour.
Interesting.
I still don't think it's the best color by any means. I think white and red certainly, can claim those spots. But Separatist Void Mage is quite good. It's just a very good card, and it's not very committal is the nice thing. It is actually the kind of blue card I like because it does not put you into any particular place. It's a good support card. I think blue is a good support color.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, I would actually take the Void Mage, too. I just think it's look, if a card's worth it, I will commit. But I don't think Castellan is, and I don't think Gaia's Revenge is either. It's not that I think both cards are excellent, but a 7-drop pack one, pick one, that is just so not anywhere near where I want to be. It's double green, which I guess probably doesn't really matter given that it's 7, but still, I just have this aversion to picking 7-drops unless, they're kind of game-winning 7-drops. And I don't consider Gaia's Revenge a game winner. It's really good, and it does give you 7 mana worth of punch for sure, but yeah, going back to our grading scale, right? What about these big bombs that help you stabilize boards that you're way behind on? Gaia's Revenge isn't particularly great at that, and I don't feel like the payoff is big enough. If I'm in green and I have a couple of Leaf Gilders or whatever, then this Gaia's Revenge looks a lot more enticing. But I don't have anything in my pile yet, and I'd much rather play a card that I'm more likely to actually want, and I think that is Separatist Void Mage here. Plus, it's just my favorite card in the set. Let's not lie.
Yeah, you just don't want to start the draft with a 7-drop that isn't, Gaia's Revenge is good, but it's not premium. It's not like a Majoring Responder, right? That's the kind of 7-drop you wouldn't mind starting with.
Yeah, I did that, and I didn't like that either, to be honest, but I felt bad about myself. All right, so what's next? Let's talk about, all right, so there's a couple of things that I want to talk about this show. First, I want to get a few kind of post-Pro Tour decompression going from both of us. Stuff we saw, just any stories or things that popped up that maybe we thought the listeners might find interesting or useful. And then we're going to talk a little bit more of a meaty topic. We've been talking a lot about Origins, and we thought we'd throw something a little more concrete at you, kind of trying to merge a few of the concepts that we talk about on the show, and one of the main ones that we talk about, and just hammer on it. It's one that I find very important. It's, cards that affect the board, and I'm trying to come up with a better name than that, but we're going to be talking about that after the PT discussion. So first thing that I wanted to throw at you, Luis, after playing the Pro Tour the whole way with we called it the Vancouver Mulligan, the new Mulligan where you get to scry once after you, if you Mulligan. What were your thoughts on it? You're a game designer, you're a professional Magic player. What did you think?
So the first game I ever played with the new Mulligan rule was game 1, round 1 of the Pro Tour.
All right. So sample size not huge.
I exercised that option.
Oh no. you couldn't wait to try it out.
Shows how unlucky I am, really.
Well, you just couldn't wait to try it out, right?
But it did let me keep a 1-lander on the play that I would not have been able to keep without that rule. It was, we were playing limited now, and I drafted this red-white deck and mulliganed a 7-card hand that was awful into my 6-card hand, which was a mountain, a cleric of the forward order, and a crone sergeant, and just 3 other spells.
Mm-hmm. But
I kept it with the scry and was able to scry a card at the bottom and then draw and play my land on turn 2. So, that was sweet. And honestly, that sort of situation is why the Mulligan rule, I think, is incredibly good for limited. It eliminates, or reduces rather, the number of non-games you have. Basically, anytime someone mulls to 5, you're pretty close to a non-game. I did win on a mull to 5 actually in the limited portion, but in general, when you mull to 5, you're in big trouble. So this reduces the number of mulligans to 5 because it lets you keep a wider range of mulligans to 6. Since a lot of times when you keep a or look at a 6-card hand, if it's one land or one spell away, you can frequently keep it with the scry because
and you're correct to do so.
I believe so. Like especially like on the draw, a 1-lander on the draw on 6 cards, I would always keep on with an extra scry. And even on the play, I think in particular the hand that I kept, it was high reward. If I drew a plains, which I ended up doing, it was 2-drop, and then if I drew another land, it would play a 3-drop, and I did have a combat trick in my hand, and that's just a good hand. So I think my win percentage there is higher than if I mulligan to 5. As it turned out, I actually did lose that game still, but I got to play it. And as a result, I think it's an unqualified good thing for limited. I'm not ready to say that for constructed yet. That I would like just more data, because what it does for constructed is it does reward decks that are trying to assemble specific combos or synergies a decent amount well. Like we actually, my whole team played the Ensoul Artifact deck in constructed. The Mulligan rule is very good for that deck because that deck's really, really looking for Ensoul Artifact and a combination of things to put it on. The Mulligan rule really helps it find that. Whereas if you're playing like, Esper or Obzon Control, and you mulligan into like 4 land, 2 spells, and you scry, the scry is so much less likely to help you than if you mulligan into like 1 land Ensoul Artifact, or Ensoul Artifact but no Ornithopter, or Ensoul Artifact but no blue sources, or whatever. Or a hand that just needs an Ensoul Artifact in particular, or turn 2 Hangerback Walker, like the really powerful early plays. Or to use the example of Mono Red, which a lot of people played at the Pro Tour to good effect, a Mono Red deck can now keep these like 1-landers with the extra scry because all they need is a spell, or they can keep a hand where there's a scry and you land at the bottom, and it's basically like +1 card because lands don't do anything for them once they have like 3. Whereas the decks that need higher land counts or are just trying to trade 1 for 1 instead of assemble something good like a good aggressive start or a good combo, the scry is much less valuable. So because of that, I would like to see what it does. I think Magic Online will tell us a lot of that. You will see what the different win percentages are of these different decks. And obviously, like, it's a new format regardless, so we kind of don't have a control group, but we can still look and see what happens.
You think that, do you think that if it was too much of an effect on constructed, let's say they were like, oh, this is just pushing these, like the decks like you were describing a little too hard, that they would kill it, but keep it for limited? That doesn't seem like an option, right?
I don't think they're going to end up with different rules for constructed and limited. I don't believe that's going to happen.
It seemed bad too to do that. Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious to see it. I know the response was mostly positive. From my perspective, just chatting with players and kind of being on Twitter and stuff, people seemed to like the change quite a bit. There were some dissenters, though, that popped up a little bit later that were saying, this could be bad. We have to keep an eye on this stuff. And some of them were taking very strong stances, which I guess I don't really understand how you can take like a super strong stance if you don't have the data yet. But I don't think that Wizards is going to do that. I think they're going to wait until they get data. I saw a tweet from Aaron that said he's going to get it from Magic Online or something. So maybe they'll do a trial on there or something.
Well, there's 2 parts. One is data in terms of like, that is a little hard to parse. Like how, like let's say we, Mono Red and Ensoul Artifact decks start winning more, or rather start winning on Magic Online. It's kind of hard to separate whether maybe they're just better decks right now than these other decks. So like I think Esper Control is kind of bad right now, but that might have nothing to do with the Mulligan rule. So that's a little confusing. I think it is valuable to see what it feels like to play with. I can tell you as someone playing with it, it felt very good. Okay. Again, definitely limited. And even, in constructed, I was playing the deck that I think benefits most from it, or one of them. But either way, Mulligan, I think one of the key comparisons they can look at is when we talked about how much Mulligans hurt you, when someone looked at something like 85,000 games of standard and the Mulligan, the win rate on a Mulligan to 6 was so much, solid, it was like 38% or something compared to a 7-card hand. Yeah. Compared to 50%. That is pretty big. And if this decreases that gap, I think that would be a good sign. I don't think a mulligan to 6 it should or is going to win as much as a 7-card hand, but making it so you're only losing 5 to 6% on mulligans instead of losing 10 to 12% is a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at that because, what you outlined at the beginning is really the key, which is that in an ideal scenario, this rule change would make for fewer non-games, as we call them, the ones where you just never play a spell, you're discarding your opponent's playing stuff and beats you with literal any, setup of spells. Those are something that I think Wizards would be quite happy to just get rid of entirely if they could, because those games aren't ever fun. The natural progression of the mana system does introduce, people still getting mana screwed and mana flooded, and that's important to how the games end up playing out. It makes for more exciting comebacks. It lets, the less experienced players win sometimes. And, there's been other games that have tried just doing away with the mana system type thing entirely, and those have failed quite miserably. So I like the nudge in the right direction here, but then it does get weird. If it incentivizes players to play decks that are more like the mono red or the Ensoul Artifact decks that you were talking about, well, that is weird. That's certainly not an intended consequence of changing this rule. You'd like to keep it flat, right? But the fact is, it could just be a greater upside for the whole of the game, and you just let those decks have a little bit more oomph. The hard part, I think, for Wizards of the Coast is going to be to quantify it. That part is, I have no idea. Like, you need to quantify the gap gained in, let's say, a mono red deck, and then also an Ensoul Artifact type deck, right? I mean, these are just the flavors of the week. It's going to be, something else every day as we go forward in Magic and as these ones get left behind. And then you need to quantify the difference in gap for an Obzon deck or a control deck or whatever, and start seeing what the differences is, right? It's not just, well, this favors mono red. That isn't the end of the conversation. It's how much does it favor it? Is it giving it a huge push? It seems unlikely, but it's possible. I don't know. And, they have to figure out, well, if red gets a huge push and mid-range decks, get a medium push, is that difference big enough for us to not do this? And then also factoring in what you said earlier, Luis, it's great for limited. It seems to really do well in limited overall, right? And so they have to try to factor in all these things where what are they willing to give up, to have this rule, and is for the greater good, is it better? I'm glad I don't have to make that decision, to be honest. It just seems very difficult to actually pin down how to do it. But like I said before, and you mentioned it too, overall it seemed very positive. We were doing it on all of our coverage drafts, and I agree, it felt really good.
Yeah, I'm a fan, and I would be surprised if it did not get implemented going forward.
Yeah. Any changes to card evaluations, opinions on the set, or anything like that after having now the full PT experience under your belt?
I think that, again, my color ranking was very tentative last time, but this time I have a little more solid. I like red and white the most. I like black after that, but I actually think that green and blue are just battling for the last spot.
Okay.
Green, yeah. The thing is, I think blue is better than I thought it was, but I still don't love it. I actually don't think any of the colors are undraftable by any stretch, and I think that my color preferences are not so heavy that I would take, I'm not taking a card that's a 6 out of 10 that's white over like a 7 out of 10 that's green necessarily.
I see. So you're willing to stay. Yeah, that one of the stories kind of, I guess, from the limited perspective from some of the pros was that they really disliked green. That seemed to be the color that they were trying to avoid. I don't share such a strong disdain for it. I think that you need to be able to have a world where you can say green is the worst color, but also not insinuate that it's terrible or bad. They can be fairly bunched together. I know that R&D tries to make sure that the colors are at least somewhat balanced and doesn't leave one just completely in the dust. I think that, if you're on a development team for one of these sets and you're, doing the limited testing and the drafting and such, and, one of the colors is just clearly worse than the others, I think that's a mistake. I think something should have been tweaked or bumped to help even things out. And I think they think that way too. It feels like they did a pretty good job with this one. I don't think any of the colors are woefully out of whack. I think I've won or had at least successful decks in all of the color pairs at this point, probably. So, yeah, I don't know. Green does seem to be the one that most people had last, though.
Agreed. I still, like you're saying, I don't think it's wildly out of balance.
Yeah.
I think if you open a good green card, you should take the green card. It's not. This isn't like, Black and Avacyn Restored, where you really don't want to be having any swamps in your deck or anything like that. So,
what were some of the cards that overperformed that you saw?
Some of the cards that overperformed are actually in a similar kind of space. Those are Amprint Tactician, the 3/3 gives your whole team +1/+1. This is just good in a game where you're racing and you curve out, and I think a lot of the games end up there.
Yep, I've had the same experience. I played 2 of them in a row, and it's just like I'm leaving 3/3s behind that kind of mess up combat and hitting really hard.
Yeah, you'll play that and let your 3/3 attack into their 4/4, or your 2/2 attack past their 2/2, and that's just, it's not 1 extra damage. That's sometimes 3 to 4 extra damage.
Mm-hmm.
Grasp of the Hieromancer, the enchantment that gives ++1, and when you attack, tap a creature. That's exactly the kind of card that we tend to not like because you get punished pretty hard if your creature's dealt with. But man, in these fast games, this is a removal spell the turn you play it. If it's not answered, you tend to just win the game. And often you're just able to play these enchant creatures and not get punished for them. I think that Grasp is actually pretty good, and similarly called the Full Moon, the +3/+2 and Trample enchantment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is awkward that if anyone plays 2 spells, including you, the turn you cast this card, it goes away. As Paulo like to say, this doesn't cost 2, this costs all your mana. Because you're not allowed to play anything else that turn.
Yeah, but that's funny.
+3/+2 and Trample is no joke, and as much as I hate playing cards like this, again, this card really does some damage, and you just throw this on a random flyer, and your opponent's just dead if they don't have an answer. I did also happen to have 2 Hero Varroas in my first draft deck, so I got to smash for 10 with this.
Dear God.
Actually, my best draw of the tournament in Limited was turn 2 Throwing Knife, turn 3 Hero, turn 4 Call the Full Moon, equip Throwing Knife, attack for 14.
Oh my God.
My opponent just drew and conceded. It was pretty great.
That's insane.
Besides these, on the flip side, I think Disperse, the bounce spell for 1 and a blue, is quite good. I always want to have 1 or 2 of these.
I mean,
in my
this
blue
is
decks.
apropos of our previous conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, this deals with the kind of BS miser cards I was just talking about, and also just good in a fast format.
Yeah.
And
it's just like the premium way to interact. It's the second best way to interact with creatures on turn 2 to 3 or whatever, right? Like Fiery Impulse is better, but if you don't have that, then Disperse will fill in for, okay, good, at least I'm not dying this turn to, random aura or just a creature that got renown and is kind of running away from me.
Right, and then Water Courser, the 2/3 for 3 mana that can pump for +1/+1/-1. It's surprisingly solid. This was nothing impressive the first time it got printed in one of the other core sets, but it's been quite good. It's actually a pretty beefy blue creature. So
the 2/3s are good.
As surprising as it is, I think this card is quite strong. And then I guess the last of the commons, and I guess one uncommon that really impressed me was Majoring Bully, the 2/2 prowess must attack. I'm not saying I love this card because I still think it does have some pretty big inherent risks, but honestly, just about everyone I saw who drafted them played them, and you just need 2-drops. If you end up with a deck with 2 2-drops, then you're just going to be behind, and Majoring Bully's a 2-drop. So
no, I have the same experience. It's like, it's weird because, I like to try to construct scenarios, right? What's my best case? What's my worst case? What's my average case? And figure out where it goes. And when I do, usually my Majoring Bully scenarios end up being kind of bad, and times when you draw it late, and it just, I just always look at this card like it just doesn't really do what I want. But when you need critical mass of 2-drops, this thing is hard to block. It really is. There's so many tricks in the format, especially if, they already have another creature attacking 2, and you're just like, great, I can't block both of them because if they have a trick, they kill my first one, and then the Majoring Bully gets bigger and kills my other one. Prowess really matters. And I think that one thing about Majoring Bully is that it really tests your knowledge of the format because it must attack every turn. So your opponent doesn't get the option to bluff. It's just a matter of do they have something or not. And, I've seen people take hits from Majoring Bully where it was like, there's nothing that they could have here, like outside of, just fiery impulsing the thing that you blocked with or whatever, like just some, would have killed it anyway type scenario. And there's also other times where it's like, crap, there's a lot of cards that my opponent can have to pump the bully. I'll just take it again. And I just find that the way it ends up playing out in this format, often enough, they just never can really block it, or at least, can't do it easily. And Majoring Bully, pulls its weight.
Yeah, it's very important when you're deciding whether to block Majoring Bully is that you block it on a turn where you're not getting 2-for-1, because Disaster is blocking Majoring Bully with like a 2-3, and then them casting Fiery Impulse on your 2-2.
Yes. Oh, I just get the shivers.
If you block with a 2-2 on their Majoring Bully and they cast a normal combat trick, that's a 1-for-1. It's not the end of the world. What you want to avoid are the situations where they cast a combat trick, or like they attack with 2 creatures and you block Majoring Bully and then they pump the other creature that's also in combat, and that's when things start to really get ugly.
I think by the way, it's a really cool design, because these type of must attack cards are usually like, they're so like, you play your 2-3 and their 2-2 that must attack is just going to get eaten most of the time. But Majoring Bully puts a really crazy twist on it for the reason that you said, where they're targeting other things and still getting value from their bully. I think that's pretty cool. Sometimes he does get eaten.
Yeah, I like both Majoring Bully and Jessian Thief because Prowess plays interestingly on a creature that they have heavy incentive to block, and a creature where you're forced to attack, because both those things push your opponent into blocking.
And you just always attack with your Jessian Thief?
Well, the Jessian Thief, that it's always going to get blocked. No one's ever going to let you bluff a Jessian Thief hit through.
No, that's true.
So that's a little different, but Majoring Bully is the opposite, where your opponent knows you're forced to attack, so you would attack even if you didn't have a trick, so that makes it less likely that you have a trick, which means your tricks are great.
Yes, it's true. Crowan Jailer? Why do I keep seeing this card everywhere?
I don't know.
Am I just off? Like,
no, you are not off. I had multiple opponents play a Crowan Jailer against me, and it was awful. It was not even remotely good.
So bad.
Yeah, it was great. I had one of my opponents keep a 7-card hand, play turn on a Crowan Jailer, turn 2 nothing, turn 3 tap your Maritime Guard, and then they had a 4-drop, but like I got to play out spells. I played 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, but I won the game. And yeah, that is part of the reason that a Crowan Jailer is just so bad. This was the game I mulled a 5, actually, now I think about it.
Oh, wow.
I mulled a 5, and I went turn 2 Maritime Guard, turn 3 Knight of the Pilgrim's Road, turn 4 Tactician, turn 5 Tactician. And I ended up winning the game because my opponent hadn't really played much. Wow.
Yeah, I saw the Jailer in the future match area at the PT. I saw it in Dallas. I was surprised there. I thought, okay, well, by the time the PT rolls around, that little guy will get weeded out. And he didn't. He just kept showing up. I was like, the relief test still passes. When they play that card, I'm like, oh, thank God. Could have been a real card. And, I think the other thing about it is just that, like, any time that it could be a real card, it dies to like everything. It just dies to every single thing. So even if they were going to get you with it, you can, you have the option of killing it with almost any removal spell as well. So yeah, whatever. I'm still against that one. And for some reason people still keep playing it, and I'm just going to let them do it.
Yeah. I'm all for that.
Now, what about some of the archetypes? I see that you've got a blue-black control deck you wanted to mention here.
Yeah, so I actually have 2 different blue-black archetypes I wanted to mention. And the first one is blue-black controlled. And last week we did talk about how there's not much of an incentive to play control. And I still believe that. I still believe that you shouldn't be going into a draft looking to play control. But if you're going to play control, blue-black is actually the place to do it. And one of the main reasons is Possess Scob. So the key cards for this...
Love that guy.
Yeah, Possess Scob is great. It's for those of you who don't know, it's the gold card, the 3/2 for 5 that returns a creature or spell from your graveyard to your hand. And then when it dies, you exile it. Mm-hmm. So the key cards for this deck really are Possess Scob, removal, especially Reeve Soul. Reeve Soul, there's a reason it's the best black common. It's just so efficient. And then card advantage engines like, besides the Scob, Tower Geist, Jessian Thief, Read the Bones. And this is the kind of deck that actually does play a normal control role, where you're trading removal for their creatures, playing cards like Guardians of Meletus, the 3-mana 0/6, drawing extra cards via these cards like Possess Scob or Tower Geist, or if you're lucky, Jessian Thief, and then finishing the game with a kind of slower win condition like Shadows of the Past or Sphinx's Tutelage even. Revenant I've found to be decent in this deck because you end up playing Screeching Scob and Return Centaur to mill yourself sometimes.
Yeah, Ringwarden Owl can get the job done in a pinch.
Yeah, Ringwarden Owl is a fine magic card. It's a little slow, but in this deck, I think it frequently will attack for 4, and that's pretty good. It helps that blue and black do have a pretty good amount of removal when you combine the 2 colors. And again, Possessed Scob is the reason you're in this deck, and that's how you end up here. I think that's one of the things to look at when you're drafting a deck that's not the normal kind of deck, is how do you end up in that deck? And the main reason is that Possessed Scob is a card that's first pick power level that you can get 7th pick.
Yeah, it's I have a story about this actually. So we did a bunch of drafts over the course of the PT weekend, and I was doing pretty well in them too. I was I've been playing online and doing these drafts, and spoiler alert for our main topic, but I've just been drafting these sort of straightforward cards that affect the board strategy type decks and having good success with them. And I sat down for another draft, and I opened up my pack and I took some white card, whatever, Stalwart Avon or something like that. And then my next pick, I took some decent white card again. And then the next pack was like a fine red card. And I'm well on my way to that same deck I've been playing every single time. And then I get 4th pick Possessed Scob, and I'm just like, screw this. I'm just like, I can't do this anymore. I don't care if I lose. I don't want to just play creatures and beat down and play combat tricks. I want to do something sweet. And so I took the Possessed Scob and I moved in on blue-black control, just scrapping my first 3 picks, which, if anybody who watches my drafts, that I don't do that lightly, as far as that's a reckless move, right? I took a blue-black card when I had all red and white cards. I mean, it's just and there was probably something decent in the pack for my deck, but I couldn't do it anymore, Luis. And I took the blue-black card and I moved in, and I drafted a really fun blue-black control deck that I ended up going 2-1 with as well, which was sweet. But also, I just really enjoyed playing it. It was just like, thank God. It was like a palate cleanser from these successful but ultimately kind of boring decks.
That was a good detour into a humble brag of I did great in all these drafts.
I just wanted to let you know that I
was able to identify the blue black is open. Did great in that draft too.
Look, I wasn't humble bragging. It's just the truth.
If you were on the humble brag, you'd say that you went 5-1 in the Pro Tour in limited, but.
Oh, jeez.
Wait, that wasn't humble.
That sounded very not humble.
Actually, I don't think either of the decks I drafted were great. They were just. I posted them both on Twitter, but they're both it was just a red-white aggro deck and a blue-white aggro deck.
Yeah, well, the secret of this format, you do not need a great deck to win.
No.
You do not. You just need these solid board affecting. Yeah, anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Going back to blue-black, finding out that blue and black are open is half the reason to go into blue-black control. I mean, a little more than half. I would say of my straight blue-black decks, I would say most of them are on the controller side rather than the aggressive side. But you also don't default to that. Sometimes you will draft a blue-black deck that has, Scrapskin Drake and Ringwarden Owl and Shambling Ghoul and Void Mage Separatist and still just attack your opponent to death.
True.
But if you do end up picking up Possessed Scob, a good amount of removal spells, something like Shadows or Tutelage, then you can draft a blue-black control deck, and something like Languish helps too if you're lucky enough to have rares. But don't really go looking for it, but this is something that you should have in your arsenal. You should know when the cards are there, when no one else is interested in drafting control, and because this is the thing, draft is self-correcting to some degree, where if everyone's trying to draft these 2-dropped aggro decks, you can draft the deck with Maritime Guard into Guardians of Meletis into a powerful late game. If no one else is taking Read the Bones, if you're getting 10th pick Read the Bones, which I have seen happen frequently because people are like, yeah, I've got to affect the board.
Yeah.
Then drafting a control deck does have some appeal, though I don't think it should be your base for it.
Sure. Go ahead.
I was gonna move on, but if you have
I wanted you to go to the next blue-black deck.
I thought you were going to tell us about some other winning draft records.
I could go on all day if you want.
Wow. So the other blue-black deck is on the opposite side of the equation completely.
In the sense that it's not a real deck, and the other one is.
Well, yes. So this is also blue-black.
Mm-hmm.
This is blue-black 1-drops. And this was the deck I alluded to last episode of decks I was testing.
Right, I remember this now.
Right. Actually, right before we recorded our last episode, I was in the middle of playing a draft with this deck. But how this deck works is the key cards are Fairy Miscreant. You want as many of these as possible, obviously, because what Fairy Miscreant does. Thornbow Archer, the 1-mana 1/2 that drains or shoots them for 1 if they don't have an elf. Bonded Construct, and Warhorn. And all these cards sound, well, they sound not great. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you can get like 10 1-drops in this deck, and you could just kill your opponent out of nowhere. Well, it's not out of nowhere. They get pecked to death. They see it coming, but it's very rapid.
Like, so what's the key? Like 1-drops and Warhorn? Is that the deck?
1-drops. So it's 1-drops, Warhorn, bounce, and removal. So Separatist, Void Mage, Reeve Soul, Claustrophobia. You know, the normal good cards. Mm-hmm. Nantuko Husk is amazing in this deck because frequently, not only do you have a bunch of crappy creatures on the board, your opponent's at like 10 life by turn 5 sometimes, or even earlier. And another card that's really good in this deck is Scrapskin Drake. That's kind of a card that I've had trouble finding a good home for because it's so bad in the control decks.
Yeah.
But Scrapskin Drake's very good in this deck. Consecrated by Blood is another great one. The enchantment that gives +2/+2 and flying. You just kill your opponent out of nowhere, and it really does put them on a very fast clock. So the way you end up in this deck, well, the first one is you're a maniac.
Yeah, you're crazy.
Well, that's actually how I tested this deck. Is I just started by taking Thornbow Archer over Fiery Impulse, pick 1, pack 1.
Okay, so you were testing.
That's for testing purposes. I would never do that in a real draft. How you end up in this deck, jokes aside, is that you start, let's say you start your first 4 picks, let's say, are normal blue-black cards. Like you took Reeve Soul, Void Mage Separatist, Claustrophobia, and then maybe something like Nantuko Husk, right?
Okay.
Those are just reasonable picks. You could be going anywhere with those. But you notice that there was a Fairy Miscreant and a Thornbow Archer in your first 2 picks. And then 5th pick, you see another Fairy Miscreant. At that point, if you take that Miscreant and then you take, let's say, a Bonded Construct, all of a sudden, you're kind of drafting towards this deck. And if you wheel all the 1-drops that you saw, you can be confident that this deck is open. At what point you just slam all the 1-drops you see, you slam Warhorn, you slam Scrapskin Drakes, and you just try to kill your opponent as quickly as possible. So I actually played against this deck round 1 of the Pro Tour. Which is funny. I'm glad I tested it. One of the advantages of testing stuff like this is you actually know what's going on. So I played against actually Li Shitian, who's in the running for Player of the Year.
Yeah, he ended up getting 3rd, I think?
I believe 3rd, yes. Yeah. And game 1, he goes turn 1 Fairy Miscreant, turn 2 Fairy Miscreant, turn 3 Scrapskin Drake, turn 4 Thornbow Archer and Nantuko Husk.
Holy crap.
And then he Separatist Void Mages my creature, and then I just died.
Wow.
And I was like, well, I tested this deck. I know what's going on here. My sideboard plan was crazy. It was I was playing red-white, but I had an Evolving Wilds. I sided in 2 forests to go with 2 aerial volleys, the 1 green instant.
Oh my god, really?
Deal 3 to flyers, divided any way you choose, which is great against Fairy Miscreant, by the way. I sided in 2 of my own Bonded Constructs, which I had ended up not having enough low drops to play, but are good blockers.
Yeah, that's your defensive speed.
Exactly. And I sided in a Ascetic, the 1-mana, 2-mana 1/1 that destroys enchantment because I saw Claustrophobia and because it's an early blocker. And I sided in Guardian Automaton, the 4-mana 3/3 that when it dies, game 3. Just for basically, I took out all my slow cards.
Yeah.
And I ended up beating him games 2 and 3, partially because of these cards.
Did you get any aerial volleys on him?
I didn't. It was unfortunate. I had aerial volley in my hand the last game, but his Fairy Miscreant got sacked to Nantuko Husk early enough and then didn't draw multiples, even though he had 4 in his deck. So, but
wow, that's crazy.
But this blue-black deck, it is a real deck if it's open. The main thing I don't like about it is it kind of forces you to move in without knowing how many of all the 1-drops are going to get open in the draft. Because
right, like when do you actually spring for it? I like this scenario that you laid out where you've got reasonable cards and now you're kind of picking up these other pieces later. But I mean, how committed do you need to be to this thing?
I think this is a good tool to have in your arsenal. I do think it's good to know about this deck because it can. Anytime you find a deck where you're happy playing a ton of cards no one else wants, that means you can spend your first 5 picks on actual good cards, Separatist Void Mages and Reeve Souls and the like, and then you're wheeling cards that are also very good for you. You just get more picks out of every pack. The fact that you're transforming trash into treasure is very valuable. That is actually one way to up your draft win percentage.
Oh, totally.
The downside is that even if nobody else is taking any of the 1-drops you want, sometimes the draft has 2 Fairy Miscreants total. Sometimes you're going to end up with 4 1-drops, and then the deck basically the whole basis of the deck doesn't work at that point. At which point you can still be blue-black aggro. You can still play a Screeching Scob into Nantuko Husk into Separatist Void Mage and have a removal spell in your hand. That is still valid, but you shouldn't end up trying to draft this deck without a good backup plan. And I've tried to force this deck like 5 times now, and 2 of the times I ended up with one of the times I ended up with straight blue-black control. This deck didn't even come together at all. I ended up with a good blue-black control deck. So it's just fine. One of the times I ended up with a blue-black aggro deck that had none of this going on at all because it didn't come together. And then the other 3 times I had versions of this deck, which were decent. This deck can really punish slow starts. And if you hit Warhorn plus like a bunch of Fairy Miscreants and Scrapskin Drake, is really hard to race.
It is really hard to race. Yeah, I faced Warhorn a couple of times in the format, and it was scary. It really was. It was like, I can't kill all these things.
So another thing to note is that Whirler Rogue plus Nantuko Husk is insane, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, Whirler Rogue is an insane card, so that doesn't say much for it just because that card's already so good.
Oh, you mean the constructed All-Star Whirler Rogue?
Right. We played 4 in our constructed deck.
Exactly.
But in particular, it is gross with Husk. It makes the Husk unblockable and gives you 3 creatures to sacrifice to it. So if I'm blue-black and I have Whirler Rogue, I am going to move Husk up on my list. And what drafting this blue-black deck also taught me is that, Husk can be really good in one of these aggressive decks. So
yeah, BDM's been playing a lot of different Husk decks. He kind of smacked me around with a few of them in our coverage drafts as well. And I'm definitely got my eye on Husk as a potential up-and-comer, a card I never thought was terrible, but maybe it even has a few more spots to shine than I thought it did originally.
Are you calling BDM Husky?
I didn't call him anything. I just scooped up my cards and walked away.
So those are 2 of the slightly more esoteric draft strategies. Blue-black control isn't really. That's kind of normal. That was kind of expected. But the blue-black 1-drops deck is not the sort of deck you're going to end up in unless you're really trying to. And, if you want to have a bit of fun, I think it's worth trying out. And sometimes it can actually be good. Li Shiqian ended up going 2-1 in the draft that we did. And I know a couple other people who do like that deck, when it presents itself. The problem being you kind of have to jump in and hope that there's a landing there.
Yeah, that is the hard part. Okay, let's move on to our main topic. This isn't going to be a super long one, but it is a drum that I like to beat, and I wanted to kind of get on it here for a little bit more of a cohesive presentation of it, as it's a concept that we talk about a lot on the show, and I've been talking about it more, and that's with purpose. And we're talking about cards that affect the board, and I don't really have a name for this as a strategy. I guess just solid fundamentals is a good way to call it, a good thing to call it. But basically, when it comes to Origins as an example, and this is kind of what reminded me to talk about this on the podcast in a way that was more direct rather than just bringing it up, once every other show about, something in context. I kind of wanted to hit this nail on the head a little harder. And like I said, it reminded me, Origins did to talk about it. And it's a strategy that we generally recommend on limited resources anyway, which is, you're newer to draft, or maybe you're just not that good at it, or you're in a situation where you really want to improve, but you're not really sure what you're doing wrong. One way to do that is to improve your fundamentals. And that's something, that I took that from basketball. When I was young, I played basketball all the time. It was really all I cared about. And, one of the things that the coaches would teach you, and my coach taught me, was that you have to be good at the fundamentals of a game before you can be good at the fancier, trickier stuff. And, when you're young, you don't really want to hear that, right? You want to make a move like Michael Jordan made. For me, when I was in high school and stuff, I'm just like, oh, I want to do all these dunks and this crazy stuff. And it was like, yeah, but like if you can't get to the hoop, you're not gonna be able to do that. And if any competent defender's on you, you're going to need to be able to do different things like dribble and pass and shoot as they apply for basketball. And in draft, there's actually a lot of corollaries with that. And they're not as obvious though. And a lot of people skip them or ignore them and get punished pretty hard for it. And they do it for years. I know people, at the local game store and stuff that are just completely oblivious to these concepts at all. They have no idea that there's another way to draft that's a lot more fundamentally sound. And I think that if you're a newer player or somebody who is struggling with draft, that if you apply these principles, you will see improvement. I genuinely believe that. And then I also do recommend branching out from here. I don't think that what I'm going to present here is the end all. Though I do know plenty of very successful limited players who do basically just take this strategy every time whenever they can. But like I said, it's not the end all. It's just a really good place to start. The sort of holy trinity for this strategy are creatures, most important, not close, removal, and combat tricks.
So the acronym that you put on here is cards that affect the board strategy, so CABs. Time to call it CABs.
All right, so we're gonna call a cab. Yeah, cabs. Yeah, and so but these three main pillars are really the most important. And believe me, creatures are the most important thing in limited, period. I know that removal is more valuable because it's a scarcer commodity, so you could make the argument, well, no, removal is more important. But the reason why removal is considered more important is, like, when you open it, is because there's not as much of it around. But creatures are what make up your strategy. Creatures are the thing that give you repeated sources of damage or repeated blocks that can blank cards from your opponent and that can really change the way a board state looks, where removal, can do the same thing, and it is important, but it's all about creatures. Combat tricks is the other pillar here, because these allow you to employ a strategy that's consistent and that has a similar game plan from format to format. And if you can get a good balance of all three of these things, and not other stuff, which is really kind of the core that we're going to be getting at here, you're going to have a solid deck. And that is in many ways the goal of fundamental limited play, is to have a solid deck that does what it wants to do consistently. And that's hard to get. I don't want to beat around the bush about that. That getting a deck to do what you want it to do consistently is difficult. And every time you put in cards that don't fit this sort of shell of creatures, removal, combat tricks, and then some of the stuff that I'm going to go over in a few minutes here, you're taking away from the deck's ability to function similarly time after time. There are exceptions, of course, always in Magic when you would want to do that, but there are times where you don't. And I have examples. I've actually got a lot of examples here for some of the cards. But I'm gonna sort of set the stage for the discussion based on a game that actually happened to me today. Okay, and when we talk about cards that don't affect the board, we're speaking pretty literally about that. Cards that just don't change the way that your creatures are interacting with each other and aren't a creature themselves. An example would be Read the Bones. Very good Magic card. I gave it a high grade in the review. We mentioned it earlier in this episode as a card that we both liked, and if you're getting late picks, you should be taking them because it's good. But it doesn't affect the board, and that can matter. In this case, I had a very basic curve on my side. I was playing, I guess, red-white, and I played a Cleric of the Forward Order on turn 2. I was on the play. My opponent played a land on turn 2 and didn't play a spell. They just didn't happen to have a 2-drop. And I played a Knight of the Pilgrim's Road on turn 3 and attacked with my Cleric. I said go to my opponent, and my opponent played a land and played Read the Bones. Read the Bones is a perfectly fine 3-mana spell, but they drop down to 16, and they're not casting another spell this turn because they're tapped out. And I'm sitting here staring at currently 5 power, about to go to 6 thanks to Renown. And my hand, I guess I wasn't white-red, I was white-blue.
Splashing claustrophobia?
No, I was white-blue. My hand was
like
Mighty Leap.
Violate some of our principles.
If I had done that, yes, it would have. But no, I was white-blue, and my hand was Mighty Leap and Claustrophobia. And I'm looking at this board like, I can't lose here, right? And I mean, that's obviously a little bit hyperbolic, but how far ahead am I at this point?
It's not really that hyperbolic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
I
attacking.
guess your opponent could cast a Languish or something.
Yeah, they need something ridiculous to get themselves out of this scenario. And it's weird because I think that people don't remember these cases that often when they're like, oh, I'm going to put these cards in my deck that don't do anything to the board, and they don't necessarily grasp what that means. Now, again, I have to be careful when we talk about this because I play read the bones. It's good. Like, that person should have had it in their deck. I think the fault of their deck was that they didn't have anything to do on turn 2 or 3 that affected the board. And, maybe it was just a bad draw from my opponent. That happens. But ideally, you would set up your deck so that you had as few draws like what my opponent had as possible, meaning they would have played a creature, ideally, on 2 or 3, or a creature and a removal spell on 2 or 3 to keep me from this. Because my draw was super nothing great as far as creatures go. I played basically a vanilla 2/2 into a 3/2 that, can get bigger. It's like these are not the premium 2 and 3 drops in this format by a stretch. I could have easily had much better draw than this, even without any rares included. And it just so happens I had these two. And so, I use the example to highlight this cards that affect the board strategy. When you play ones that don't, they do add up and they can get you. One thing that you can do and what that you can get out of playing a strategy that always or nearly always affects the board is that your decks will be more consistent and they'll be generally consistently good. The thing to keep in mind is that it's also rare that these strategies are like superbly good, right? Like the best thing that you can do in a format or the most powerful thing you can do in a format. Oftentimes you're kind of eschewing some of that super high end stuff because that comes with a lot of risk or a lot of setup cost or a lot of other things like that. But if you're going to be the player that concentrates on building these super straightforward, streamlined decks, you can really punish the people who don't. The ones who don't prioritize these fundamentals of, and I'm going to go over them actually. In fact, why don't we just do that now? Here's some of the fundamentals, the hallmarks of this type of strategy, these baseline things, right? One thing, you'll find that most of the spells in decks like this are relatively mana efficient. This isn't anything groundbreaking, but it is something that you'll consistently see in these decks. These decks really respect the vanilla test. They're not usually playing, your 3/2s for 5 or your 3/3s for 5 or whatever. Or even if they can avoid it, they're not going to play a 2/2 for 3, for example. They would rather keep their creature curve closer to the vest as far as efficiency goes. And I don't mean to say hyper efficient either, right? Like I mentioned Cleric of the Forward Order, Knight of the Pilgrim's Road. These are run-of-the-mill, we call them a C, right? They're the card that you're probably going to play in your deck, but they're not really mind-blowing on any level, but they're mana efficient. They pass the vanilla test, basically. A huge hallmark that you'll see from these type of decks is a good mana curve.
One way to think about this is don't be, when you look at what creatures you're drafting, the default should be 2 and 3 drops. Yeah. And 4+ drops are kind of like luxuries. Like, you don't need these to fill out your deck. You do need 2 and 3 drops, especially 2s. One of the biggest ways to lose in this format is to just not have enough 2 drops, especially since there's a lot of high quality 3 and 4 drops. You can run out of space for those. You can't run out of space for 2 drops, basically. Yeah. So in order to make your mana curve good, just prioritize 2s, prioritize 3s, don't prioritize 4+. When you take a 6 drop or a 5 drop, you're taking something that has a very limited amount of slots that you can fit it into. When you're taking a 2 drop, it's giving you the freedom that later you can take a more expensive card because you have those extra slots.
Exactly. And again, looking at the example I gave, a fairly run-of-the-mill example, I think, for Origins, but this does count in many others. Most sets, I would say that this is valid for, is I was rewarded because I had a 2 and a 3 drop. And I put plenty of those in my deck so that I had the best chance to play a 2 and a 3 drop in succession on their respective turns. And my opponent stumbled, and it didn't take much for me to run them over. Another hallmark that you'll see of this strategy is most, if not all, cards affect the board. This is huge. This is what I named the strategy after, this fundamental deck, right? And if you look back at your decks, if you keep them in Magic Online and just go through, try to figure out how many of the cards you play don't affect the board. How many, right? And again,
to give you a good, I guess, a good comparison, I'm looking at the 2 decks I drafted on the Pro Tour. The first one's red-white. It has 16 creatures, 4 combat tricks, and 3 removal spells.
So you were 23 for 23.
Right. And The second one is 20 creatures and 3 removal spells.
Yeah. So you were you were 46 for 46. You perfected. And again, we have to be careful, right? I don't want to vilify cards that don't affect the board. There are time and places for those type of cards, and they can be important. But look, if you're looking to clean up your game and you want to get your decks in shape where you're giving yourself the best chance to win from this sort of fundamental standpoint, cut out the ones that don't affect the board as much as possible. And this is where you'll hear me in the set reviews and such, and you'll hear me be skeptical about cards that really don't do much, right? Like Read the Bones draws you cards and can help make you hit land drops and find more spells. It can really do a lot. But like, let's look at Sphinx's Tutelage, for example, right? A card that I know a lot of people like. And it does have this sort of uniquely powerful thing of saying, if the game goes really long, you're going to win and you don't have to do anything else as far as attacking or whatever. It's a cool card, but these are the kind of cards I'm very wary of. I look at that card and I'm just like, you might be the linchpin for a successful strategy, but it is not a fundamentally good strategy. So what that means is that card has to really pull its weight for me to come around. It has to really bring something powerful, unique, potent, if it's not going to affect the board, like Read the Bones does. And it does. Read the Bones does bring you that type of thing. But Tutelage makes me think, no, that's not quite enough. And so it's a high bar for me to want to play the card. Now, everybody has their opinion on Tutelage. That's fine. I've lost to it. I've beaten it. I get it. It can be a powerful card. But if you want to get back to basics, if you want to do this fundamental deck, then you're not going to be playing cards like that. And you're going to have your bar set higher. You're going to have your standards higher than that and not be loose about that. You're not going to say, it's fine. Like, I'll just run it. It'll be okay. Yeah, it doesn't really fit my deck perfect, but maybe I'll win with it. Get all that out of your head. Like, you have to hold yourself accountable for the deck that you're building and take it seriously, right? I mean, Magic's fun, but if you want to win at it, you're going to have to employ some self-discipline and say, look, I can't just tell myself it's fine. This card's fine over and over again and expect to keep winning. I need to be, a little more regimented about it and say, no, this card does not clear the hurdle that I need it to clear, and I'm going to play Knight of the Pilgrim's Road over the Sphinx's Tutelage, even if I think Tutelage is cool. And I think Knight of the Pilgrim's Road is super boring or whatever. I'm not even disagreeing with you on it. It's just, you got to hold yourself to it. Cards that affect the board. That's a big one. Don't forget that one. You want your cards to affect the board. And again, going back to the basics, creatures, removal, combat tricks. Those are sort of the holy trinity of these board affecting cards.
It's funny because this is none of this really is new information. This is all stuff we've talked about. It really holds true, especially for this format, more than almost any that we've played recently, which is good timing.
It's what reminded me, yeah.
But honestly, like, I know a lot of people who don't really internalized this, and I know it took me longer than I should have, partially because I love drafting these decks with a bunch of nonsense cards in them. Mm-hmm. And if you just do this, you're gonna win a lot more. I found that out. My decks are a lot less cute. I don't try to do these things as often as I used to. Sometimes it's right. Like I said, sometimes like the blue-black control decks I was describing earlier, I think sometimes you're supposed to draft that deck. Sometimes you're in the right seat for that. But in general, you're not going to go very wrong if you just draft a good curve and good removal spells. Yeah.
And you're totally right. We've talked about this stuff on the show, I mean, honestly, for years. But I felt like it was a good time to revisit, but also to encapsulate it all in one thing, because we talk about all of these different things under different umbrellas in different episodes, but I don't know that I've ever sat down and talked about this fundamental deck, this fundamental strategy of just saying, do this and come back to me and let me know how it worked for you. Because if you're struggling with draft, if you take this advice, you will improve. It will be one of the biggest level ups that you can have, is by taking this holistic approach to your decks, and then start branching out from there. Find the exceptions. Do something crazy. I mean, look, if you come watch my stream on a random night, I'm probably not drafting a deck like this, but that's because I've made the conscious decision to try something cool or to have more fun, or because the chat wanted me to take a card or whatever. And that's cool. Like, I would never begrudge anybody that. But if you are here to get better and you're struggling, do this and it'll help. Now, I've got a bunch of examples from Origins of cards that you want to try to avoid. Okay, so I just talked about the cards that you want to play that affect the board, but here's some of the categories of cards that you will want to try to avoid while you're doing this sort of, fasting of bad cards or less impactful cards. So some of them: card draw spells, Read the Bones, Artificer's Epiphany, Nissa's Revelation, right? Build around / value enchantments or artifacts. We're talking about your Sigil of the Empty Thrones, your Shadows of the Past, your Pyromancer's Goggles, your Tainted Remedy, Alhammaret's Archive. These high setup cost, narrow cards that sometimes pay you back but often don't. Get those out of your deck. Just don't play those if you're going to try this approach. Those are all gone. You just don't play those. Counter spells. Bone to Ash, Calculated Dismissal. Look, again, these aren't bad cards. Most of these, some of the ones I just named were pretty bad. But a lot of these cards are perfectly playable in the right strategy. But if you want to get back down to fundamentals, get Bone to Ash out of your library. Get Calculated Dismissal out of here. You want to be proactive. You want to be the one asking the questions and forcing your opponent to react. Because I can present you with another scenario that's similar to the one before. I play turn 2 Cleric, turn 3 Pilgrim guy, and you have Bone to Ash in your hand. You are in not a good situation. You are going to take a big hit of damage if you don't tap out for it. And if you decide to leave it up, even if you counter a creature from me, you're still taking all that damage because Bone to Ash does not affect the board. So again, taking those out of the equation will help streamline your decks and make them more potent and more sort of one-directional. Life gain spells, Healing Hands, right? You don't want to spin your wheels, even on a card like Healing Hands, which gives you the card back. A lot of life gain spells just don't. They're just like, gain 8 life for 5 mana or whatever. Get all that stuff out of here. Of course, anybody who listens to the show knows that we're not playing these pure life gain spells. Healing Hands is an exception, but again, doesn't do enough. Get it away. These temporary effect cards, Act of Treason, Send to Sleep, Hydrolash. I mean, look, you might have the right deck for them, make the exceptions as you see fit, but basically, if you can turn your Act of Treason into a 3-drop creature, do it. Get Act of Treason out of your deck and play something that affects the board now. Every time, no matter what, you cast 3 mana, you have a creature to show for it, and you don't have a situation where it's like, well, I'm behind and Act of Treason isn't winning me the game, or my opponent has a whole bunch of small tokens and my Act of Treason doesn't do good. You're trying to eliminate that variance where a card's very good or it's very bad or it's pretty good or it's pretty bad. And it's never really just solid. It's always something up high or something down low. You want to get that out and get this baseline set in place. Just bad cards, right? Your Reclaims, your Vine Snares, your The Great Aurora, Demolish, whatever. I don't need to tell you about those. You're not playing those. And then also keep an eye on the very mana inefficient cards, your Bellows Lizards, your Night Snares, your Catacomb Slugs. Even though like 2 of the 3 I just named do affect the board, they're just so mana inefficient that they're not up to snuff for what you're trying to do for this. So
I also played against one of those cards, and in fact, my only loss to Limited was to a deck that played in Bellows Lizard in both the games they won.
Oh no! Did they have, what was it, like a tactics deck or something? Or
they had Kithion the Planeswalker, or rather the card that flips into the Planeswalker, and maybe a tactic. I actually did see them cast a tactics as well, so yeah.
Well, condolences.
not saying Bellows Lizard is unplayable, but it's not great, and I did lose to it.
Right. Okay, so those were a bunch of examples of things that you just want to clean out of the closet and just get these board affecting spells in there instead. Other hallmarks that we'll see. Again, we've talked about your cards being relatively mana efficient. You're going to have a good mana curve. Most, if not all, of your cards are going to affect the board. Another one is you want low setup cost cards. Setup cost is a thing that actually I came up with, a year and a half ago or whenever that was, to describe cards that ask things of you. You're going to play the card, but what is it going to give you back? Well, if you play a Knight of the Pilgrim's Road, it's going to give you a 3/2 body that can get bigger. And it's a relatively mana efficient play. That's a low setup cost card. All it really asks of you is that you have the mana to cast it. Otherwise, you know what you're getting, and there it is. High setup cost cards are ones that require certain circumstances to be in place to make them good. You want to try to avoid those. You want to play low setup cost cards that you pay for them and you know what you're going to get every time, and you get it every time. Even if it's not great, right? one of the things that you'll notice, of course, about high setup cost cards is they often reward you if you do satisfy the setup cost. But what we're trying to do is take that down a notch. We're trying to eliminate this strikeout home run effect and get a bunch of, we call them solid doubles, right? That's a baseball reference, but it's a, you did very well at the plate, but it's not the, oh, I got nothing or I got everything. We want to try to just do a bunch of cards that just do very well. You're going to play 2 colors. Now, there's going to be formats like Khans of Tarkir. They're going to throw a wrench into that where you're going to play 3 colors. But for the most part, in Magic, in Limited, you're going to be playing 2 colors. You're not splashing. You are not going to splash. I need all the listeners to repeat that to themselves because it's so tempting. And I've seen so many people say, oh, I've got a free splash. And it's not free. It's almost never actually free.
Free splash isn't a real thing.
Right. Free splash is a myth. You will sometimes find yourself in a position where you have a very low cost splash, and I get it. But for the purposes of getting back to the fundamentals, you're not splashing. You're playing 2 colors. Another hallmark of this deck, it has a simple, clear game plan of beating down the opponent. That is how you're going to win the game. You are going to take your opponent's life total from 20 to 0 in a methodical, curve-out way where you are going to beat down, you're going to back up your creatures with combat tricks and removal, and you're going to take their life total down to 0. That's how you're winning. There's no like, oh, I'm going to do this mill plan, or I've got my Shadows of the Past and I'm going to try to grind them out and do all this. Nope, you're attacking. That's how you're going to win. And these decks win through attacking with creatures. That's how they win. I mentioned it before, but I'll say it once again. This strategy wants solid doubles over the strikeout home run cards. If you have the choice between a card that can be very, very good or very, very bad, or a card that's always pretty good, you take the always pretty good card and you put that card in your deck and then you play Magic with it. So those are the main points. Those are the main hallmarks that I came up with for this strategy. Luis, did you have any other that came to mind for you of sort of conceptually thinking about, what does this deck want me to do? What does it look like?
No, but I have to admit, again, as someone who took a while to come around to this,
mm-hmm.
It does actually work better than I would have hoped.
mm-hmm.
It's pretty simple, and part of the reason to learn something like this it's the same reason why I think it's useful to learn about blue-black control or blue-black 1-drops. These are all part of the skills you can draw on while drafting. This is more important, obviously, than knowing about how to draft a ridiculous fairy miscreant deck. But if you know how to do this, then you have a good baseline, and that gives you a better sense of when you should not follow it. And I think everyone will do better if they start by learning how to follow this first. When they learn how to take the 2-mana 2/2 with no abilities over the sweet 5-drop.
Yeah.
When they learn how to take Titan's Strength, the cheap combat trick, over a more expensive, more interesting card.
Right.
And once you get to that point, I think you can start to diverge and you can start to look at other options you have. Because again, we're not saying this is how you should draft every single time.
No.
We're saying that if you draft like this every single time, you're probably going to do pretty well. And learning how to do this is important because it's hard to go from not knowing how to do this to knowing how to draft all these other strange decks. It's much easier to go from knowing how to draft a very fundamental deck to knowing when it's not necessarily always the place to do it. And I kind of took a more circuitous route. There weren't as many resources, limited or otherwise, back when I was learning how to draft.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of found my own way. And part of it was I did like to draft these, kind of overcomplicated control-ish or combo-ish decks. And yeah, those are good sometimes. There's definitely sometimes when that's the right thing to do. But it took me a lot longer to learn how to draft this fundamental way. And I think had I known this from the outset, I think I would have probably overall done better in Limited.
Yeah. From a big picture perspective, right, this kind of strategy is about long-term consistency. That's what you're going for. You're going for the safe play over and over and over, and you're going to benefit from it. You can win matches in many ways. Your opponent stumbles on mana. They go too deep, right? They are playing, their plan is to play Sphinx's tutelage into Dreadwaters or something like that, right? And they've just kind of gone off the deep end. You're just going to pound them. They can't find their splash color in time. Your greedy opponent thought that they had a free splash. It's not free. They find out a little bit later while you're beating them down with 2/2s and 3/3s. They play just too many non-board affecting cards like the ones we talked about before, or their deck is just slow. It's clunky. right? Like the one that I played against in my example. I mean, it wasn't the card they played a turn 3 Read the Bones. It's nothing, terrible, but their deck was just a little too slow and clunky. And I found myself with a fairly pedestrian draw miles ahead of my opponent. One of the huge benefits that you get out of this too is that not only are you able to punish the people that have these issues, they're slow, their deck isn't consistent, whatever, you're less likely to experience those problems yourself if you do this right. You're not going to mulligan as much. Why not? Because you have a solid mana curve with a lot of 2-drops and 3-drops that you can cast. Even if you only have 2 mana in your hand, you still get to play Magic, where your opponent, who was a little lazier and kind of forgot to draft a few 2-drop creatures, all of a sudden they need to hit land 3 and 4 to really, deploy their strategy, and you don't. So you get to keep your hands more often. You're going to get to play spells, even if they're maybe not your best ones, than people that have a bad curve, right? You're going to get to curve, and they're going to have a less likely chance of doing it. You're not going to be as slow. Your main strategy is to beat down and win. So you get to be proactive, and you get to put pressure on your opponent and make them react to you, which is, that's a very good position to be in Magic in many ways, assuming that, your opponent doesn't have the perfect answers. You're going to be able to really leverage that and get value out of cards like combat tricks and certain removal spells.
Another advantage to doing this is that cards that let you come back from a losing position tend to be higher rarity, and they tend not to be that frequent. So once you're in a winning position, there's not that many cards that you can get your opponent out of it. Whereas this deck, if your opponent does stabilize, it's not like you just lose. It's not like we're playing a deck with no creatures that can block and no cards that cost more than 2 mana.
Right.
We're just saying you're playing a deck that can get ahead and win from ahead. And if their opponent does manage to stabilize, then you get to play a fair game of Magic, but it's not like you've conceded that either.
Right, because you still get to play Magic, and you might outplay your opponent or entice them to make a mistake or whatever. Now, there is some downside here. I thought I would touch on that. I think, Luis, you covered this pretty well a minute ago. Again, it might be easy for the listener to walk away from this segment thinking that this is the way that we think you should draft and that there's nothing else. And that's just absurd. If you watch our drafts, you'll know that Luis and I both try to take either a ridiculous or at least more well-rounded approach to drafting to the table. But I do recommend this as a palate cleanser and as a way to sort of get yourself centered back on the fundamentals. But, one thing that you're doing is you're putting a little bit of a kind of a ceiling on how powerful your deck can be, right? If you're never taking the home run cards, well, you're never going to hit a home run. Now, as a pure spike, which I am not, and I don't think anybody really is pure, that you're fine with that, because you know what? You will win more with this strategy than going for those home runs. So your win percentage will bump up. And if that's your primary motivation, or if that's your only motivation, you're going to be pretty happy with that. The problem is that basically everybody I've ever met, most of them, don't fall into that category. They all have a little twist. I mean, I would call Luis and myself both quite hardcore spikes when it comes to Magic from a big picture perspective. But we also both like to draft a control deck. Luis likes to go deep with some stuff. If you checking out our streams or videos, you'll see that we'll try some stuff. I mentioned it earlier in the episode here that I just tossed away my first 3 totally reasonable picks because I just got sick of drafting basically the deck we're talking about here, and I wanted to do something a little more fun. Look, everybody has that. So there is a little bit of downside into how straightforward these decks can play out, but trust me, it's still fun. You're still playing Magic, and winning makes up for a lot of the of the downside of it. It's also worth noting, and this does touch on what Luis said a minute ago too, but if this is the only strategy you knew, it could be hard to adjust the formats that don't particularly support it. Thinking back to like M14 or Rise of the Eldrazi, these slower formats that, like, if you tried to play, I mean, what was it called? Glory Chaser, Luis, in
Glory Seeker.
Glory Seeker, yeah.
2/2.
Yeah, and that would be like kind of a hallmark card for this type of deck, and it was completely unplayable in Rise of the Eldrazi.
So bad. It's funny because Glory Seeker's shown up in a number of different formats, and in, say, Onslaught, it was a card you would take 4th pick and not be that unhappy about, whereas in Rise, if it was in your deck, you were in trouble.
You were in trouble, right? Like, and that was just representative of the strategy that you were going for. So, look, you can't have this always be your strategy, but I will say that if this is your baseline strategy, I predict a lot of wins. I do. There's a lot of pros that just play this basically every time that they can do it. this should be the way that you start out drafting. This should be your baseline for fundamental draft strategy. This should be your go-to strategy. And you should have the ability to branch out into other things when it's correct, whether the format dictates it, whether the draft table you're at dictates it, whatever it is. If you look at an experienced but ultimately unsuccessful drafter and told them that they had to change their strategy to one that was more exclusively a board affecting one, I am confident that their win percentage would go up. And that's really the bottom line for this is I think that once you start from that standpoint and then work the other direction, it kind of opens your eyes to a lot of these cards and a lot of the ways to evaluate them correctly. And again, I firmly believe that if you take this challenge and try to stick as closely to the hallmark, the hallmarks and such that I just outlined, that you will win more if you're struggling in draft right now. That's it.
Classic cabs theory.
We could call it that. I don't actually care what it's called. I just care that, people try it out if they haven't yet. But then, that is. Go ahead.
Then when we come up with a theory that destroys cabs, we'll call it Uber.
All right, it's officially cabs theory then. So hopefully this is helpful for you at home as well, and you can employ it on your next draft, or at least start thinking about things in these terms. That is going to do it for the show this week. I want to remind you that Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com each and every week. Make sure you check them out for a host of free content as well as a full selection of Magic merchandise. And gpsandiego.com is where you can go if you're planning on coming out to the Grand Prix. If you do, make sure you come and say hi. I'll be there. Luis will be there. We're going to be doing some boothing. We're going to be in the coverage booth for the weekend with Paulo. And I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be a really fun one. If you would like to find us on social media, I am Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can also send us an email if you've got maybe something a little longer than 140 characters, lr@lrcast.com. And you can find everything related to the show, including links to both my stream, Luis's stream, the Facebook page, the YouTube channel. You can find the subreddit, all of it on lrcast.com right there on the front page, to make it as easy as possible for you to find all the things that you want. Limited Resources. That is going to do it for the show this week. Thank you so much for hanging out, and we'll talk to you next week.
So I've touched on this before, but this last tournament, and actually the content of this podcast kind of reminded me and made me want to bring it up again, and that's kind of keeping an even keel while losing. And part of the reason I bring that up is because I started the Pro Tour 4-4 before ending the tournament at 10-6. I actually had to go 6-0 in order to get gold in the start of day 2, or in order to guarantee it rather. And actually Eric Froelich ended up getting second place in the Player of the Year race. Also, of course, one of the hosts of Constructed Resources. He started the tournament 0-3. And
which
he went
is insane.
From 0-3 to 11-4. He went 11-1.
He rattled them off.
Right. And both of us really rallied. And that made me think, like, man, it is so easy to give up when you are not doing well. And you are spewing so much value when you do that. If you start playing worse or feeling hopeless when you start losing, you're going to lose so much more, because a lot of the times when let's say you're trying to go 7-2 to make day 2 of a Grand Prix, for example, or you're trying to make top 8 of a tournament that's 8 rounds, for example, like a PPTQ or I guess at this point the RPTQs are smaller, but let's say a PPTQ or a Grand Prix trial, something like that. Mm-hmm. If you start 0-1 and you get into this frame of mind where you can't, I'm not going to be able to do it, I have to go 6-0, all these things like that, I think you're giving up a lot of your value, because a lot of the ways to get to 7-2, to get to 6-1-1, to get to 12-4, they involve losing first, then winning. If you look at all the different probability trees of how you get there, a lot of those trees start with early losses. I mean, you're less likely to end up there if you lose early, of course, but if you cut out all the times when you start 0-2, you don't get to 7-2 nearly as often. And being able to stay focused and kind of play the same is really important. It actually goes for when you're winning too. I've had people ask, like, oh man, what if you're 8-0 and you need to go 3-0 to top 8? It's like, well, you should play the same as if you're 2-2 or you're, 4-1 or whatever.
Right.
Because the game you're actually playing doesn't change. And that kind of goes back to the draft strategy we talked about this week, actually. The classic Cabs theory, which is that you shouldn't draft differently really based on where you are. And, when I'm 0-0 in the Pro Tour, my first draft, I drafted the exact same as when I was 4-4. At least I tried to. My fundamentals and my plans were the same. And the same is true if you make top 8 of a tournament, or if you're drafting, just at your local store on Friday night, or you're drafting on Magic Online in a 6-3-2-2 or a 8-4, what have you, or a Swiss draft. If you're trying to improve and you're trying to win, you're trying to get better, I think you should kind of treat these as the same. You should try to figure out the best way you can do it to not lose focus and to not give up. And I don't know, it's the sort of thing which I think bears repeating because it's so easy. I've played in so many tournaments and it was still really hard for me to reconcile, being 4-4 with wanting to continue to play and to try to continue to play my best. But I was able to. I went from 4-4 to 10-4, and I think part of that is because I didn't drastically alter what I was doing. Yes, I started out by losing, but I don't think I was losing because I was, had the wrong attitude or was playing in a vastly incorrect way. I just was losing my games. And as long as you're confident that you're not making these like huge fundamental errors, you should generally play the same way in the last round you do in the first round. Of course, it's good to always reevaluate, and it's good to look at the end of a tournament and say, like, what could I have done better at that tournament? There's always something. I'm not saying that I assume I played perfectly and always operate under that assumption, but I try to stay, as much on an even keel mentally as possible, and, going with, these fundamental strategies, I think really does help with that. Something you can fall back on. And just looking at this last tournament really reminded me of that, because it is something that I've had to, put into practice a lot more often than I would have liked. You can't always start 9-0 and just, cruise into the top 8. Sometimes you start 3-2 or 2-3 or worse, and you really have to grind out those wins, but you shouldn't change what you do. And enough people have asked me about, well, what would you do if you were in this position, that I really have to say that none of that should change. What your record is, what record you need to do something doesn't really affect what your in-game decisions should be. And if you're letting it do that, I have to believe you're losing value. So, keep a positive outlook and believe in the heart of the cards, or something like that. or just play the same way you want them to go. That's probably slightly more realistic, but I'll go with that one.